Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and this is Reading Roundup number 3. This will be the last reading roundup for February. I am getting so excited about March Mystery Madness. I have all kinds of fun things planned for the month of March, so stay tuned to this channel and check out the upcoming videos. They're going to be really great. So, these are some more books that I read in the month of February, and we're going to get this started with Crooked Heart by Lissa Evans. This is a World War II historical fiction. I heard about this book from, I think it was Jane Catherine on Books did a short review of this book. Sounded intriguing, so I checked it out from the library. And I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was kind of funny, but also a bit sad. And so the 2 main characters in this book are Noel Bostock, who is 10 years old. And before World War II starts, he is living with his godmother, Maddie, who is a former suffragette. And they live in this huge house in London, but unfortunately Maddie is starting to decline with her age. She is starting to experience dementia, and life is pretty difficult for them. She dies and the war starts, and Noel is one of the children that gets evacuated out of the city when they're worried about bombing raids in London. And so he ends up in St. Albans, which is, I don't think it's very far north of London. It's one of the suburbs. And he ends up being taken in by, now what's her name? Vera Sedge. Now, Vera Sedge is an interesting character. She is a 36-year-old widow. She lives with her mother and her young adult son, and Vera seems to be a bit of a con artist. She basically likes to do kind of whatever she can to make easy money, and she's not too worried about whether it's totally legal or not. And so she only ends up taking Noel in because she could get some money out of it, I think. But the two develop this really interesting relationship. So it's this great story of family and found family, some interesting elements of life in London and around London during the Second World War. There was also some hilarious letters interspersed throughout the story written by her mother to Winston Churchill. And they were so funny and a little bit unexpected. For example, part of one of her letters says, "We need more police on the streets, not sitting eating plates of tinned peaches and custard sauce from a brand new jar in the back basement of St. Albans police station," which is something a friend of mine saw through the window one evening. She ends her letter with, "Well, I think that's all for now. I saw your picture in the paper last week, and I hope you don't mind me saying that I wonder if you're getting enough fresh air. Yours faithfully, Flora Sedge." So yeah, I quite enjoyed this. There was a little bit of, every once in a while there was some language that I didn't like, and I understand, you know, people curse and whatever, but it seemed a little bit jarring when it was in there, and I wasn't a huge fan of that, but there wasn't a ton of that. Ultimately, I quite enjoyed Crooked Heart by Lissa Evans. Next up, I read Murder for Christmas by Frances Duncan. And I really enjoyed this. I gave it 4 stars as well. And this is it's the 4th in a series of 7 books. This one was published in 1949. And the main character is Mordecai Tremaine. And I don't know a lot about his backstory, but he's not a police officer and he's not a detective, but he gets himself caught up in these mysteries and is asked to help solve them. And so in this case, he gets invited to the home of Benedict Crane for the Christmas season. He gets a letter from Nicholas Blaze, who is the confidential secretary of Benedict Crane. And in this letter, Nicholas says that something is wrong and he's scared. And that's enough to convince Mordecai to go to this country house for the Christmas season. He doesn't have a huge acquaintance with Benedict Graham, but he is interested by this letter, and so he heads out. The back of the book, this is hilarious. A festive mystery for the holiday season, mulled wine, mince pies, and murder. So Benedict Graham is famous for inviting large parties over the Christmas season. He appears to love the Christmas season and decorates the house and plays games and brings in carolers. And one thing that that he is known for is that he brings in a Christmas tree that he decorates himself, and he ties presents for all his guests on the Christmas tree. And he does this Christmas Eve so that Christmas morning the guests can see the tree and find their presents. Well, of course, Christmas Eve, Mordecai is woken by a scream, and when he gets downstairs, there is a dead body under the Christmas tree. And in this case, it is a dead body dressed as Father Christmas. So it was a really enjoyable read. Of course, there were multiple Father Christmas costumes, so you had to figure out what was going on with that. There's mistaken identity. There's a great cast of characters. I really like Mordecai Tremaine as a character. He was very interesting as well. And I've read one other of the books in this series and quite enjoyed it also. So I'm going to be on the hunt for more Francis Duncan mysteries, especially these Mordecai Tremaine ones. I really enjoyed them. So if you like kind of that golden age era of fair play mysteries, I can highly recommend Murder for Christmas. And I want to read to you a bit from the prologue so you can get a taste of it. No one could have foretold how it was going to end, not even the murderer. It is not to say that the crime was hastily conceived and clumsily executed. The majority of murderers are anxious to live to savor the fruits of their villainies. They realize that one slip may deliver them to the hangman. They know that to be careless is to be lost. And in this case, the murderer possessed both desire to profit and the knowledge of how perilously thin the dividing line is between safety and disaster. But no human plan, however devilish in its ingenuity, can be depended upon to follow in practice the exact lines of its careful theory. Somewhere along the route, incalculable and unforeseeable, will lie the unexpected, the unknown factor. The moon was like a spotlight playing over the stage of a theater, or like a camera tracking over a studio floor and alternately presenting its audience with close-ups and long shots, sharply outlined image and somber obscurity. The snow had stopped, but the sky had not yet cleared. The clouds were drifting sullenly, as if reluctant to leave a prey freed only with difficulty from their grip. Sometimes they would gather menacingly upon one another and would crowd over the earth, grown dark and full of fear. And then it would seem that they were thrust impotently apart, and the white light would flood down, cold and revealing, and not to be turned aside. And in the moonlight, every detail would be there in hard relief. The black and white roofs of the village under the hill, the thin bare arms of the trees along the roadway, the white smooth downs rolling up to the sky, the big house with its old gray stones, and the white tracery where the snow clung to the creeper. From the village came the sound of a bell. When the darkness was triumphant, it was a strange and mournful echo that could not be located and that held a note of menace. Imagination needed little encouragement to liken the sound to the tolling of doom. But when the scene lay exposed under the moon, the fear and the mystery were driven back. The bell was no longer sinister. It was a glad sound of music that carried triumphantly across the snow, ringing out from the square tower of the ancient church. The landscape was a Christmas card in 3 dimensions. There would have been no incongruity if a sleigh drawn by the reindeer had come sweeping under the brow of the downs. It did not, in fact, seem fantastic that the red-robed figure of Father Christmas was outlined in the moonlight, moving quickly along the terrace of the big house. It was, after all, Christmas Eve, when such things, particularly in such a setting, were to be expected. Although it was late, the occupants of the house were not all in their beds. High up in one wing, a light still burned. At intervals, a figure crossed the illuminated frame that was the window. There were other signs of activity that were not quite so apparent, but if one watched carefully, it was sometimes possible, especially when the moon was obscured, to see a faint glow behind the windows of the ground floor. It was a glow that changed its position out as though it owed its origin to a flashlight carried by someone who moved stealthily within the house. And outside in the snow and the shadows, there were muffled, hidden figures. Concealed from the house and from each other, they watched intently and waited upon opportunity. The atmosphere was brooding, tense with foreboding. Fantasy and mystery, violence and death were abroad. It seemed that time was moving reluctantly and with an ever more tightly coiled dread towards some terrible climax. And at last, the climax came. It came when the bell had stopped. It came when the moonlight, searching again through the clouds, swept softly across the white lawns, revealing the ragged line of footprints. It came when the cold light flooded up to the half-open French doors and, tracing the moisture on the polished floor, came to rest upon the red thing of horror that was Father Christmas, stark and sprawled on its face in front of the despoiled Christmas tree. It came with a woman's scream, desperate, high-pitched, and raw with terror. Murder for Christmas by Francis Duncan. Next up, I read We Shall Not Sleep by Anne Perry. This is the final book in her World War I series. There's 5 books in that series, and they follow the family of the Reeveleys. Joseph Reevely is a chaplain. His sister Judith becomes an ambulance driver during the First World War, and his brother Matthew is an intelligence officer in the security services. And I really enjoyed this series as a whole. It had good mysteries in each book, but it also, Anne Perry did such a great job of highlighting elements of the First World War. I remember one of the books, and I don't remember which one it was now, but she had a description of a gas attack, and it was horrifying. So these were really good historical mysteries with great historical detail, but they were also just really good mysteries. And I gave this particular one 4 stars. So if you like historical mystery, if you like World War I, check out Anne Perry's World War I series. Next up, I read the 4th in the Jasper Fforde's Thursday Next series, and this is Something Rotten. Thursday Next is a literary detective in a, let's say, an alternate universe. It's London in the 80s, and it is so very difficult to describe the world that Jasper Fforde has created with this Thursday Next series, but I am all for it. I do not read a ton of science fiction or fantasy, but I love this Thursday Next series, and even if I don't fully understand this world that he's created, I am happy to be along for the ride. And so if you've never read any of the Thursday Next series, check them out. They are very entertaining. There is a lot of literary references. In the first book, The Air Affair, someone is kidnapping someone is kidnapping characters from literature, and Jane Eyre gets kidnapped. Anyway, so they're just very entertaining. I really enjoy the world and the stories and the character of Thursday Next. So this one I also gave 4 stars. It seems to me that February was the month of the 4-star reads, and that's great. Okay, next up, I read the next book in the Peter Diamond series from Peter Lovesey, Stagestruck. I've been making my way through this series and really enjoying them. They are a series about Peter Diamond, who is a detective in Bath in England. And I really enjoy them. Each book seems to focus on kind of a different element of life in Bath. And in this book, Stagestruck, we're in the theater. And it's the Theatre Royal, over 200 years old, steeped in tradition and superstition. And of course, there is murder. But first, there is an attack. Clarion Calhoun is a fading pop star wanting to launch an acting career. The audience at her debut at Bath's Theatre Royal are expecting a dramatic evening, but what they get is beyond their wildest imagination. Peter Diamond, Bath's top detective, is given the case. Soon the tension at the theater mounts, legends come to life, and the killer strikes again. So this Clarion Calhoun goes on stage for her debut at this theater, and she barely gets a couple of her lines out before she starts to scream, and they have to take her off stage to the hospital, and it turns out that she's been burned by the makeup that she was wearing. It was horrifying. Yeah, but this was another really good one, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I did something that I do periodically, and that is when I see a series, especially if it's a short series that interests me, I will just get them all and then just read them all one right after the other. And so that's what happened with these. These are Jim Eldridge's museum mysteries, and so these are historical mysteries which caught my eye, and they're all set at a different museum in England, which also caught my attention. I quite enjoy that as a setting. And so this first one, it's 1894, and this is Murder at the Fitzwilliam. And the main character in these books is Daniel Wilson. He was a police officer, and he worked with Inspector Aberline, and one of the cases that they were really famous for was Jack the Ripper. But he has left the force, and he is now a private inquiry agent, and he gets called to the Fitzwilliam, which is a museum in Cambridge, to look into a man is found strangled to death with 3,000-year-old bandages. And so he meets a resident archaeologist, and her name is Abigail Fenton, and she becomes another main character in this series. She's hilarious. She is desperate to be taken seriously at a time when women just weren't really taken very seriously in the arena of scholarship and academia, and she is so desperate to be taken seriously, and she is a bit gruff and angry, and she assumes that any man she meets is going to denigrate her. So that was a little bit entertaining. But yeah, I quite liked this. So then I picked up, right after that, I picked up Murder at the British Museum. And that, of course, is in London. And in this case, a well-respected academic is found dead in the gentleman's convenience cubicle, the stall locked from the inside. So there's a bit of a locked room element to it, and I quite enjoy that as well. And then the third one was Murder at the Ashmolean, and that is in Oxford, and that got my attention. I've been to Oxford, and I know that building, and so when they were talking about the area, and I was able to picture it in my mind, which is always really fun. And in this case, a manager at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford is found in his office with a bullet hole between his eyes, a pistol discarded close by. The death has been officially ruled as suicide by local police, but with an apparent lack of motive for such an action, the museum suspects foul play, and they call in Daniel Wilson and his now partner Abigail Fenton. So as a whole, I quite enjoyed this series. I gave them 4 stars. The second one, the author obviously has done his research and quite enjoys including his research and period detail in his books, which I'm okay with. But in this second one especially, I noticed that there was sometimes a bit too much of the historical detail. I felt the author overdid it, especially in this one. And I made a note in my, I have this notebook where I keep track of the books that I read. And I will periodically make notes about the books that I read. And in this case, I wrote, it is not necessary to put every piece of research into the novel. And so there was just sometimes it seemed like it was a bit too much, but it wasn't enough for me to not enjoy the read. And so Jim Eldridge's Museum Mysteries, I recommend historical mysteries. Then I had a DNF. I put down Ghosts of the Vikings by Marsali Taylor. Now this when I took it out of the library, I didn't realize, but it's not the first in the series. I think it's the 3rd or the 4th actually. Let's see if it says. It doesn't. Oh, there's the potential that this is the 5th in the series. And I didn't realize that at the time. What drew my attention was that this was a mystery set in Shetland in Scotland, and that grabbed my attention. But I ended up putting it down because it was too far along in the series, and I didn't know the characters and understand the some of the history. And so I'd like to find the first in this series and try again, because it looked very interesting. The main character, and I don't know exactly what she does for a living, except that she really enjoys sailing, so that's a huge part of these series. But also, her mom is an opera star or something, which I thought was interesting, and her mom is French. Anyway, there was enough interesting elements that I think I'm going to try and find the first one in a series and give it a try and see if I like it. Since I enjoyed the Museum Mysteries by Jim Eldridge, I checked to see if he's done anything else, and he has a couple books in a Detective Chief Inspector Stark mysteries, and this one is called Assassins. And what drew my attention is this picture here. This is, of course, Winston Churchill. And so this book and this series is set in London in the 20s. In this one, it's 1921. Prominent cabinet minister Lord Amersham has been shot dead outside his Regent Park home. 2 bullets to the chest and 1 to the forehead. The killing bears the hallmarks of a professional hit. Tackling one of the most high-profile cases Scotland Yard has ever faced, DCI Paul Stark is under pressure to produce a quick result. Amersham's colleague, Secretary of State for the Colonies Winston Churchill, is convinced the Bolsheviks are responsible. Stark's colleagues at Special Branch believe there's a connection to the government talks taking place over Irish Home Rule. Or could the motive be connected to Lord Amersham's scandalous private life? Then there is a second murder, once again committed by an expert marksman at close range, and the case takes a terrifying new twist. So this was pretty good too. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the Museum Mysteries, but I still gave it 3.5 stars. And then finally, our last book for this video is Compton MacKenzie's The Monarch of the Glen. I picked this up recently at the used bookstore. I really enjoyed this. He wrote this in 1941, and I wrote in my notes, it's a hilarious romp through the Highlands of Scotland, and it totally is. It's just this hilarious story about MacDonald of Ben Nevis. He has a castle at Glen Bogle, and all he's interested in is shooting birds, pheasants, I'm not entirely sure, grouse. So it's August, it's the glorious 12th, which I believe is the first day of the grouse shooting season. And so he's got visitors at the castle, including some relations from America. And all he wants to do is hunt and fish and shoot and be the monarch of the Glen, as it were. But he has hikers on his land who cause a whole lot of trouble, and it is hilarious. I really enjoyed it. It was very funny. So, the ancient clan spirit is not yet dead in the Highlands. How could it be, with MacDonald of Ben Nevis roaring in his castle at Glen Bogle? The National Union of Hikers may be an admirable institution, but there can be only one answer when its members disturb the grouse on the glorious 12th. Ben Nevis remembers the days of his ancestors when Hector the Ninth roasted 45 Macintoshes in a church. With his two stout daughters at his back, and supported by Chester Royd, the American businessman, and the doleful but effective Cameron of Kilwilly, the laird throws the hikers off his land in the ancient manner, with vastly comic results. And again, I just really enjoyed the ride for this story. It was really good, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So if you can find this book, check it out, The Monarch of the Glen by Compton, MacKenzie. And that's it for this video. So what have you been reading? I'd love to hear about some of the books that you have read recently. Let me know down in the comments, and stay tuned to this channel for some really great stuff coming up for March Mystery Madness. So I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.